Good evening and welcome to Economics Unbound. Hello Nana and dear viewer. Tonight we tackle the economics of food. We deal with the supply and demand issues in the food market. Now, agricultural economics involves the production, utilization and distribution of farming resources and aims to apply the principles and fundamentals of economic theory to the dynamics of food production, distribution and consumption. Hello, Nana.
Hello, everyone. Good. We're talking about food. Glorious food. Historically, human society has been preoccupied with the challenge of securing a sufficient supply of food to stave off hunger and starvation. As a result, much of the research on food and agriculture in the past century has focused on issues related to production efficiency, food supply, and farm profitability. Yet, in our times, we have to talk about the effects of environmental and climate change on food production. Further, dear viewer and TANs, we must address the issues of food waste, oversupply and food insecurity, as the divide between food haves and food have-nots widens in the midst of gluttony. TANs, I think we must also explain the link between food prices and oil prices.
Yes, indeed, Nana, but we must also explain the distinction and what happens when the lights go out and energy blacks out on food and families that are already food insecure. Yes, Nana, when tensions between the United States and Iran recently sent oil prices upwards, many became concerned about how this could affect food prices and increase food insecurity. There are other issues of concern. For example, although world average food production per person is increasing, there are many countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where food production has fallen in recent times tragically.
Tragic. TANs, it is understood that many economists say the world food problem concerns the dynamics of production, income, growth, demand and trade. We will discuss this later with economist Wandile Sihlobo, but now let us just kick off by telling you the story of children who died as a result of food insecurity in the Eastern Cape. Please listen to this.
Alunam Damkawo passed away on arrival at a medical facility. His 5-year-old sister Zintle died while being treated. The other two siblings, 5-year-old Alizwa Khwaibana and his 11-year-old sister Asive, also died while receiving treatment.
I was told these kids had eaten something with poison and there is nothing we can do. We should just take them to the clinic. As we were transporting the one child, little did I know the boy was also suffering on top of the bed.
7-year-old Asipile Khrobum survived the ordeal.
I had just woken up when an elderly lady told me about kids that had consumed poison. Just then, my neighbor came to alert me that my son was also involved. When I asked him, he said that he only ate chips. Then my neighbor gave him a glass of milk to drink and he was fine.
Locals are angry, saying the living conditions contributed to the tragedy.
In this area, our municipality doesn't care about us. Even my child survived there. That's why we are pleading to the municipality, even to the president, to think about what happened in our area. Here, as if we were just dumped. There's no care. We don't have houses.
The situation here is not right. You see, it's bad because here as a community we are united as a community, and then there's no hand that is coming in to help us in a way of getting jobs or be there with us, you see.
The Nelson Mandela Bay municipality says the incident is a huge wake-up call.
It looks as if we continue to have a challenge of illegal dumping in the city. And then as much as we do our waste management collection in every corner of the city, in areas where we can send our trucks to formal collection, we do every week. And in areas where we can access through our trucks, informal areas, we do send food soldiers through different forms, including the EPWP.
It is still unclear what the children ingested. Postmortems are being conducted. Siwe Songwekli, SABC News, Port Elizabeth.
Well, Tans, can we now explain the link between food, oil, and food insecurity? But before you do so, please listen to this explanation in the short package.
But first, Nana, the United Nations yesterday released a report that serves as an update on the UN Development Goals. One of the goals is the total elimination of hunger and food insecurity. Now, the report says that as Africa's growth continues to be closely aligned with commodity price cycles, a fundamental diversification of the productive structure of Africa's economies is necessary. The short-term risks in Africa are tilted to the downside. On the domestic front, weather-related shocks will likely have adverse effects on agricultural output, with dire consequences and social consequences, for that matter, for food security. In addition, political conflicts, social instability, and security concerns can affect the short-term outlook in many countries. Please take a look at this United Nations dossier on the food insecurity issue, how it affects the economy and people, and what can be done about food insecurity.
For decades, the number of hungry people had been declining. This isn't true anymore. Today, achieving the zero hunger goal by 2030 is becoming more challenging. More than 820 million people still do not have enough to eat. Hunger is increasing in many countries where economic growth is lagging, particularly in middle-income countries. Rising unemployment and declining wages and incomes are challenging people's access to nutritious foods and essential services such as healthcare. Income inequality is rising in many of the countries where hunger is on the rise, making it even more difficult for the poor to cope with economic slowdowns. Conflict and climate change are also driving hunger. Unless greater investments and more targeted efforts are made to address these drivers, we will not meet the goal of ending hunger. The Zero Hunger Goal is not simply to eradicate hunger, but to ensure that all people have access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food, and to end all forms of malnutrition. This year's State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World 2019 report goes beyond hunger. For the first time, it provides estimates of the people who face uncertainties about obtaining food, the moderately food insecure. Today, over 2 billion people do not have regular access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food, a problem that affects people not only in low and middle-income countries, but also in high-income countries. The chances of being food insecure are higher for women than men in every continent, with the largest gap in Latin America. Too many children suffer from low birth weight or stunted growth. At the same time, no region is exempt from the epidemic of overweight and obesity. Overweight and obesity have increased in all regions, particularly among school-aged children and adults. But obesity is not the opposite of hunger. They can actually be linked. There are many reasons for this. First, fresh nutritious foods are often more costly and less available than highly processed foods, high in fats and sugars. Another reason is that the stress of living with uncertain access to food and food restrictions can cause physiological changes that increase the risk of overweight and obesity. And lastly, a malnourished child has a higher risk of obesity later in life. There are other repercussions of malnutrition. The economic costs of malnutrition are staggering. Obesity alone could cost $2 trillion annually in lost economic productivity and healthcare costs worldwide. And undernutrition would reduce gross domestic product by up to 11% in Africa and Asia. Our food systems are broken, and unless bolder actions are taken soon, humanity is at grave risk of seeing a continued rise in rates of hunger, obesity, and diet-related chronic diseases. To fix our food system, we must work together. Our actions must be focused on collaboration, stretching across borders from agriculture, food, health and water to education, social protection, and economic policies. Countries need to integrate food security and nutrition into broader efforts to reduce poverty and gender inequalities. Ending hunger and all forms of malnutrition by 2030 is an immense challenge, but with real political commitment, bolder actions, and the right investments, zero hunger is still achievable.
Kwakwakusa. Otiotai. Makrojnano. Kwakwakai.
Birds.
Hello? Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, for every kind of serious, there's a glass of not so serious. Only from Tops at Spa. Not for persons under the age of 18.
You've got people salivating in my ear between my director and everybody else at the back.
This is Morning Live.
This is definitely going to be a special project.
So I wanted to create an awareness in Igama about the experiences that black women face on a daily basis that they either can't speak about or they tuck away in their memory.
The more and more women are wanting fit bodies for life, no matter their shape or size, we've been able to tap into that amazing energy.
Travel and tourism has been given a whole new meaning on Trends Travel. We uncover Africa's hidden treasures and the wonders of the world. We have our pulse on Africa's diverse heritage. A combination of entertainment and lifestyle news.
This is beautiful.
Every time you look at this
is beautiful.
You'll be inspired to explore the language and the culture.
Oh wow. This is
you want to give it a try? Like you want to wear it? So we can see what you look like. Exactly like that. Hala! La musutu wetu.
A drought is ravaging our country, plunging agricultural output, pushing food production downwards and endangering our agricultural exports. This drought is so heartbreaking and devastating that state action may be necessary. Our maize produce, sunflower produce, and others are severely affected. So is our soybean crop. What is to be done? This package tells the story of the plight of farmers.
the short end of the stick for decades. Traditional and cultural practices have also kept them at the bottom of the proverbial food chain. A case in point is where women couldn't inherit their family homes despite being the eldest. It's normal practice for men in the same position to be given inheritance. But now government says all that must change and says it is time rural women enjoy priority.
I, as a black person, was oppressed in two ways, but women were triply oppressed. They were also oppressed as women. This is why this government is biased towards women, because as President Oliver Tambo said, our liberation is incomplete without the liberation of women. Even Thomas Sankara used to say so. And so this is why we consider resources mainly biased towards women.
Agriculture is the most viable vehicle to empower women economically in rural areas and to boost their quest to economic freedom. These are some of the donations given to them at the summit. And those with different interests like seamstresses have also received assurance to support their craft.
If we go back to our crop fields to plant our vegetables, mealies and so on, so it means it will reduce the rate of crime, even the poverty in our homes.
These initiatives are only a starting point, but the aim is to ensure these women improve their socio-economic status. Atule Joga, SABC News, Nyandeni Great Place, near Libode.
If inclusive and balanced growth is to be achieved in South Africa, policymakers must take heed of the crisis in the countryside, putting jobs and people at the center of economic policy making, while we restructure towards higher productivity and higher value added activities. This will require new policy measures, including subsidies and incentives. Tandega, I understand you prepared an explanatory package about how agriculture contributes to GDP and our well-being as a people.
Well, first, Nana, let's go to our interview in Pretoria with agricultural economist Wandile Sihlobo, who joins us there in our Pretoria studio. Good evening, Wandile. How are you?
Good evening, Tandega. Thanks for having me on.
Well, Wandile, I read with great concern and interest the article you penned recently about the threats to our agricultural output as a country, and I wondered about the effects this would have on the productive sector as well as our exports and ultimately our GDP figures. Can you speak to us about that article? What prompted it and what are your concerns?
Tandega, we are coming from 2019, which was not really a good year for agriculture. If you look, for example, for the first 3 quarters of that year on the data that we have, it shows that South African agricultural sector is already in recession and it will contract in 2019, just like it was the case in 2018. So that backdrop of seeing these prolonged drought is one of the things that make us always paying attention to any signs of drought or any signs of lack of rain that we are seeing. But I think this year, the key challenge is not as widespread across the country like you would have seen in the previous few years. The hotspots or the areas that are in really difficult positions are, for example, greater part of the Eastern Cape, greater part of the Northern Cape, and some pockets of Limpopo and a few pockets of the Northwest. So those are the areas that I think that when one looks at South Africa, they are not in good shape. But now some other provinces that are key producing areas, for example, parts of Free State, parts of Mpumalanga and KZN, they've received some late rains which have changed the picture somewhat. But I think the key thing on writing some of these articles was to say, let's not only look at these provinces that are doing well and think the overall country is in good shape. I think that the key was to highlight those areas. But obviously now, when one look at it in terms of the contribution to the economy and others in contribution to in terms of the jobs in the sector, I think that what we will be looking forward to see is what really happened on a rainfall pattern between February and March. Anything that happens in there is going to be a key deciding factor on how the sector performs this time around. But certainly past 2 years have really been dismal.
Now, Wandile, your article was titled "When Rain is Not Enough." what is this delayed rainfall or absence of rain going to do to ordinary families in terms of food security?
I think the areas, again, on the ordinary families, it's really going on the provincial areas. Looking at a normal South African across the country, I would say that for now, we still have some sufficient food supplies, which means we might be in a relatively better position as the country, generally speaking. But when you try now to drill into those provinces that I mentioned, I think that's where household issues begin to happen. You think on the Eastern Cape, for example, farmers are already seeing their livestock dying because of the dryness. The rivers dried up, the felds, grazing felds drying up, and that on its own weighs on the incomes that some of the farmers get from the agricultural sector, but also on some of the food supply that small-scale farmers that are farming for household food production are also lacking in those areas, which means then now to survive, you have to have a job or some bit of an income to be able to buy food on the market. Then if there is no income and you can't grow your food because of the lack of rain, you are really in a tough situation, which is what parts of the Northern Cape and Eastern Cape are currently experiencing.
Now, Wandile, you keep mentioning these hotspots. What do we grow in these hotspots? Maize?
What we grow most in these hotspots, the Northern Cape is largely the livestock sector. But when you think about the Eastern Cape, it's pretty much the whole mixture. You have areas that are growing maize for household production, but also maize for commercial production, vegetables, their fruits, and also the livestock sector. Like I was saying, that they are losing some of their livestock, either it's sheep, it's goats, it's cattle, and all of those are some of the stocks that assist them on getting some bit of an income or economic activity in the rural side.
And how is the community in the Eastern Cape and in other affected areas coping? Are they clubbing together to fight things like foot and mouth disease? What's the community and the grassroots response?
No, I mean, from a community side, the response that has been there in some few areas is really people coming together and chipping on the money they can get to restart old boreholes and windmills. But I think that the official response that needs to be there is for the provincial government to look at its resources that are there and see if they can reappropriate some of the resources that are there to address the areas that are largely affected. And key intervention would really be making sure that there are water supplies in there for household consumption, but also availing feed for people that are on the livestock side. For the guys that are dependent on a crop production, it's really going to be a tough time for this year until they get some rainfall. If those happen later in the year, we're yet to see.
Now, Wandile, talk to us about soya bean. I understand that lately it's become a bit of an important export commodity because of the tensions between China and the US. Demand for soya bean, international demand for soya bean has shot up, and our farmers should be in a position to supply and to export. Are we sitting pretty when it comes to soya bean, or are we languishing like in other crops?
No, I mean, look, as South Africa, in as far as the soybean is concerned, we are not yet at sufficiency at this stage. For example, for keeping our poultry sector going, we import roughly about 500,000 tons of soybean oil cake, which pretty much the processed soybeans. So we are still at the process of building to be able to feed ourselves. We import a lot from South America, particularly Argentina, that is in there. The trade wars and everything that has happened between the US and China only opened in the past few months an opportunity largely for Brazilian farmers. They're the ones that really participated in there. But South Africa was not in a position to actually be able to take advantage of that. But Tandeka, I think the broader story to paint on the South African agricultural sector, it's important to highlight that we are a country that is actually food secure in as far as at a national level. I mean, we export, for example, about half of what we produce in value terms. What we are suffering or struggling struggling to address is household food security. And that is linked to people's income being unable to afford food in the stores. Not that South African food supply is expensive, but rather people just don't have any income, which then means that those areas are the ones that depend on producing in some years for themselves. And when there is a drought and they can't produce and there is no income, then conditions gets to be much tougher.
Yes, I did listen to the Reserve Bank Governor, Governor Kganyago, saying that it's been surprising that food inflation is on the low side. But do speak to us about what the United Nations is saying, that the more you have income inequality, even in middle income countries like our own, you have grave problems of food insecurity. What can we do about food insecurity? How can we insulate the kids, children and families from this problem?
I think this one, Tanega, links back to the initial insect of this program, where firstly we need to be clear about defining food security. Because when we think about food security, we're thinking about three things. We're thinking about the availability of food, which is one. We're thinking about affordability of food, which is two. And we're thinking about the quality, nutritiousness, and the safety of that food, which is the third point. And I think that in South Africa, in some pockets, people get to have availability of some of the food supply. But on having a nutritious, balanced diet, that's where some of the issues gets to come about.
And
I think
safety?
that this all links back to income.
And food safety. Speak to us about food safety, because those little children in the Eastern Cape died because the food that they accessed in the dumpster was unsafe.
And that is a result, again, Tanega, of people who don't have much income, unable to go and purchase some of the safer food, and then they ending up being exposed to some of these dangers. But if you look at what is at the retail sector in South Africa, or what is being produced in the farms, is relatively safe. But obviously when you are unable to procure that or to acquire that, then you get to be exposed on these things. And I think then the key way of addressing this, we have to think about to say, do we have a way at which we can encourage those who are unable to be economically active to be involved in agriculture? Or do we have a way to addressing people's income in terms of the jobs so that they can be able to have some money and be able to get to stores and buy some of this food? So producing for self and also supplying income, those are the two ways that we have to think about when you're thinking about this.
We have a jobs crisis in this country. Almost 10 million of us are unemployed. Can you imagine the condition in those households? Can you imagine the scramble for food and for other scarce resources? How do we mitigate this using the levers of policy?
Tanega, in as far as the unemployment, hunger in the rural areas, the key provinces that are the hotspots is the Eastern Cape, it's Limpopo, and it's KZN. And if you look across in all of those provinces, there is roughly between 1.6 and 1.8 million hectares that is currently underutilized. The key question then is to say, how do we revitalize agricultural production in those areas, focusing on high-value crops that are labor-intensive and thinking about agro-processing on a value terms, and those are the opportunities that could bring about some level of economic vibrancy in those areas, and those people will be able to benefit on that. And what I'm glad about at this point is that if you look at the Department of Agriculture, you look at the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, they are working on the new master plans, which they're beginning to highlight some of the things that could be happening in those provinces. But obviously all of this needs to be done with speed and think about developing agriculture and bringing some sort of activity in there. Because if we don't do this, agriculture is the only closest thing that can uplift those provinces in the near term. If you know intervention, we will be stuck, sadly, with some of these challenges for some time.
Speak about oil prices. At the end of your article, you worried about an elevated oil price and how that could lead to higher food prices in the South African economy, and that would put a lot of foods out of reach of ordinary people. Can you speak to us about that?
The issues of oil, Tanika, they really link to agriculture through processing and also through the transportation. You have a sector, for example, a food industry in South Africa where I would say for basic staple foods like maize and wheat, about 80% or 75% of that is transported by road. So when you have now higher oil prices which are feeding through higher fuel prices, all of that obviously gets to be inflationary now, because those who are transporting food across the country, they might be tempted to transfer those costs to the end consumer who gets then to buy this food, and then that affects people in that way. And the other channel, Tandega, is through farmers' side, because they also need some fuel for the production of the grain. You think, for example, the guys that are plowing maize, about 35% or so of their input cost is related to fuel. So oil is one of the important things on the processing and the production of agriculture, and one way it affects consumer and it affects those that are producing.
Thank you very much, Wandile, for explaining all of that to us. Well, it's time for a short break. We continue with our discussions just after this. Thank you.
We believe that the fourth industrial revolution can change things for us.
We can do telemedicine. Now that means that over a long distance or any distance, I don't have to go and visit a doctor. I can actually see the doctor online.
In Africa, we don't have sufficient doctors. In Africa, we don't have sufficient clinics. It actually makes sense.
Wi-Fi and 5G technology formed some part of the conversation that took place right here.
5G, of course, has the advantage of better experience and also the high efficiency when it comes to the cost per bit.
We haven't issued spectrum in the last 10 years. We have 4G today, which we have had to harvest spectrum from other technologies to be able to get 4G, and now it's costing us a lot more money.
Many, if not most, small medium enterprise businesses are making technology their own businesses.
On Network every Sunday at 8:30 p.m.
In my time, I've truly seen it all firsthand. Angizwanga ngizibonele ngalawa amehlo. Going through my photographs and reflecting on my memory box really brings back many life experiences that are bittersweet and humbling. In this, my homeland, I've entertained tourists and offshore traders. I've evolved from dealing with the battering system to trading foreign exchange. I've traveled to the ends of the world and tasted a diversity of culinary palates. To outsiders, I have lived alongside wild animals, tamed some, and collected livestock as wealth. So my memory box is overflowing. And don't get me wrong, I'm not bragging, but in fact, I'm breaking and hurting deep down inside of this heart of mine. Why? What for? I hear you ask yourself, my fellow Africans, friends and family. The images I have of me are those of the point of view of my onlooker, not those of myself, the subject at hand. I'm choking and suffocating at the chalice those anthropologists and filmmakers tie around me as some sort of grand name tag. Stories have been made and told of me, not of my own words. Films and graphic images have entertained millions of audiences at my expense.
Welcome back, and now I'm joined in studio by Dr. Rakwena Waite, who is the head of economics at Trade at Agri SA. Hi, thanks for joining us, Dr. Waite.
Pleasure to be here, Tandeka.
Well, please tell us about the recent research that you've been doing about the effects of energy supply on households that are already food insecure. What happens when the lights go out? What happens to food supplies that families have gathered?
I think, firstly, on the family level, it's obviously that disruption in terms of preparation and food safety. Again, if there's a long power disruption, can you keep your food cool? The safety aspect of it, and obviously the preparation side. But I think the bigger part is, if you look at linking back to agriculture, is the whole value chain, specifically from the farm, primary production, and then on to processing and transportation. The whole logistics system and the planning system gets interrupted when you have power disruptions or load shedding. The specific example as well as irrigation. Around 25% of South Africa's food is produced by energy intensive and irrigation reliant agricultural industries. So a specific example again there is planning of irrigation, scheduling, and having load shedding on your farm.
So just tell me simply, when you see those huge irrigation machines wetting all those and irrigating and watering all those huge plants across the countryside, what happens? These machines just pack up and stop when the lights go out?
So that's definitely one part of it. You can't irrigate. Then you have the cold chain on the other side. If you think about exports, if that cold chain is broken and we're working with export products, the quality can go down and we can lose the ability to export those products.
So people just stop ordering from us because the quality of our produce is affected by the lack of energy.
So you'll have specific assignments that are due for export, and that's monitored. And there has to be proof that the cold chain was maintained. And if that chain is broken, obviously then that consignment doesn't qualify for export, and that is a loss.
So what happens then?
That is a loss. That can be a loss to the farmer or the producer. So it's definitely, I think, in terms of these disruptions, there's a direct and indirect cost. It's the one is just the disruption of processes being disrupted. There's the losses of produce. There's a potential losses of products being destined for export. Then if you think about vaccinations and chemicals that need to be in a cold, also in agriculture that need to be in a cold chain, if that cold chain is broken, there's a big loss there. Then you also have additional costs in terms of mitigating it. So the one thing is just the disruption. If you're in a position to mitigate these disruptions, is that added cost. So that's an added cost of doing business. And we spoke about fuel prices earlier. And farmers, it's important to remember, farmers are price takers.
Yes.
One individual farmer cannot influence the end price that he gets for his produce. So all price input costs that increase or rise is essentially something that he needs to adopt in his cost structure.
Yes, and for some of these agricultural commodities, the prices are determined even outside of the country.
Yes, it's supply and demand, but it's not only domestic supply and demand, it's also global commodities.
Now, what happens when the farmer loses money? What's the knock-on effect on his output and on his ability to provide food, and what happens to his workers and himself?
So I think that's the biggest impact is on sustainability. So he needs to make up that loss somehow. And that links to the big drive for efficiencies in agriculture. If you think about disruptions to a process of packing table grapes, if the machines go down, that whole workforce stands idle. So that's not productive. So it's on the farmer side, there's financial losses. But if you think broader in terms of the economy, if we look at the GDP figures of last year, when we also had these incidences of load shedding, there was a decline in GDP, and it was a big part of the reason was these disruptions caused by load shedding, where the economy just stops. So there's multiple cost elements to it, but in the end, businesses need to absorb these costs. And if you think about it in this way, it's money that's kind of almost lost to the economy, productive money that could have been used in other ways.
So your predictions for agricultural output are that it will continue to shrink. And you heard Wandile saying that we are already contracting and agriculture is in recession, and this is affecting the country's GDP as a whole. How do we come out of this?
I think there's no easy answer, and I think there's so many aspects. We talked about food safety and access to food earlier this evening as well. I think, unfortunately, there's many facets that need attention. One example is the whole energy sector and the energy sector reform. With the state of the energy sector, it impacts on growth. We talked about joblessness in the country. We need job creation for people to have income to buy food. And all of these things are linked. So we need an energy sector that can support economic growth. We need job creating growth, as Wandile spoke about, the agricultural opportunities. So all of these things need to be working together. And I think a big thing is the implementation side. We often have great policies, for example, the National Development Plan, but I think the challenge is sometimes implementing those policies. And it's definitely, we need this whole value chain approach within agriculture, but also if we look at the rest of the economy.
Now let's bring it down to the household level. Suppose I'm a housewife and I've bought food for my children, for my household. I buy monthly because that's all I can afford. The lights go out, my food rots. Then what?
I think that is now the challenge that we're sitting with, that if you buy in bulk, you can save. And now it's almost taking away that opportunity to buy in bulk. But I think the reality is to perhaps, if that's the situation, to buy what you need as and when you need it. But then again, the negative side is it's a household that doesn't have that margin. They need those savings. So that's a big problem. And perhaps households can try and work together in some way in buying bulk. Perhaps that is a type of a solution. Buy something together. Grocery stockpiles perhaps. That is something that can work. But hopefully we get traction, and these incidences of load shedding get minimized.
In order to save money, certain households then cook in bulk as well. Every Sunday, people will spend time cooking. The lights go out and the meals for the week spoil, and that leads to a lack of food safety and food insecurity. What strategies can be employed at the household level, both financially and in terms of securing food safety and food security? What can we do?
I think the big element there is communication, and we've also mentioned it in terms of farmers and agriculture, and it's the same thing applies to households, is communication of when these disruptions will take place. So at least if you know there's a load shedding schedule looming, perhaps adjust your normal routine to try and work around that. I think that is the best alternative at this stage, is try and obviously get access to the information, but that's also why it's so important for the whole information campaign from Eskom side, and I think they are really trying to improve on that.
Now, how does the perfect storm in the agricultural sector affect food retailers? We can see that some of the big retailers are currently suffering. I mean, Massmart, even Woolies is suffering. So how does it affect them? How does it translate? Can you explain to the viewers out there at home, how does this happen? How do these two relate?
So I think perhaps there's two sides, and the most prominent side is the consumer side, where if you look at just the state of the economy, consumers are under pressure. Thankfully, we saw interest rates coming, the repo rate coming down today, but consumers are under pressure, and they have to cut on the expenditure. So I think that's the channel through which the retailers are feeling the pinch, perhaps, in terms of food sales, is where people are trying to save. But then obviously you have the other side as well, but the consumer side is the main element.
Now, farmers, we've heard a lot of tragic stories that farmers are killing themselves out there out of sheer frustration. The agricultural and the productive capacity of the land in many parts has been challenged by drought, and foot and mouth disease is gnawing through some of the animals. What can farmers do to survive in this climate? what can be done at the micro level?
I think there's a distinction again between the type of activity. So if it's livestock farming, to some extent, there's some mechanism of helping them. There are within organized agriculture and civil society organizations trying to help and provide feed for those farmers. I once spoke to a farmer where he was actually feeding his sheep potatoes just to keep them alive. So there's one mechanism where you can help them in that instance, or they could sell their flock. That's the type of mechanism, and then rebuild when conditions improve. But if it's a grain farmer or someone with horticulture, or for example citrus trees, if you have speaking to oranges and citrus, if there's a drought and that really is impacts on the quality of the trees and your potential harvests, it takes a lot of time to recover. On average, a generalization, it can take up to 3 years to recover from a drought. So it's much harder. You can't give a tree feed. If there's no water, the tree will eventually die. So that is some of the challenges in some of the subsectors. And then I think, so there's the practical side, trying to help farmers in that type of way. I think other mechanisms are examples of drought insurance. There is a lot of work going on looking at how government and private sector can collaborate for farmers to get some type of drought insurance and harvest insurance. So those are the types of mechanisms. But I think also just moral support amongst farmers, supporting each other, or if there's a neighbor that's really struggling, trying to help them, because there is a big human element. This is their livelihood, and that's, if you're a farmer, your heart is in it.
Now, speak to us about state intervention at two levels, at the provincial level and at the national level. What is possible?
So I think the National Disaster Management Centre is one entity of the government, and then obviously the provincial level. So a specific province can declare a drought disaster within a province, and then within their budget they can allocate specific funds, and then again they work with agriculture and how those funds are dispersed. For example, buying feed for livestock farmers as an example. So that's one local element, but then there's also a national element where through the National Disaster Management Centre and national government, funds can be made available.
And supposedly help would not only just go to commercial farmers, but also to subsistence farmers.
Yes, exactly. So the idea is to help across the spectrum of farming.
Tell me, in light of such a deep crisis in our agricultural sector, isn't it time for a multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder dialogue within the sector to compact on some of these issues and to find a collective way forward?
Yes, and I think a lot of these things are happening. It might not be in all at once as in one big meeting, but I think there's a lot of work taking place and a lot of engagement, as an example, between organised agriculture, Department of Agriculture, Water Affairs. So there are things that are happening, even the insurance industry around the insurance. So I think there is work being done, and I think it's for the country, it's also quite strategically important if we look at globally climate change and the risks to the economy and just the planet. And specifically in South Africa, if you look at what's happening in the Northern Cape, how dry it is there, and how are we going to adapt as the climate changes, and what climate change mitigation policies can we implement. And an example there, something interesting, is around the carbon tax and fuel levies. So we have these taxes, but it's not an earmarked tax. The carbon tax itself is not an earmarked tax. That goes to a general fund. So perhaps that is another example of where we can say, how can we channel those funds to specific strategies and policies or action plans to mitigate these risks.
Now, what do you think the future looks like? What are the drivers of growth in the agricultural sector?
I think firstly we have passionate, South Africans are passionate, they are resilient. If you look at South African agriculture compared globally, we receive relatively limited government support in terms of subsidies, as an example. So we totally have to compete with the rest of the world, and that drives this efficiency and economies of scale. And I think we have a great crop of farmers, and there's also a lot of work being done to uplift emerging farmers and get them into the system. So I think we have the people We must just get everyone the opportunity.
And we should unite to solve the problem.
Yes.
Well, that's where we have to end it for tonight. Good night.
It may be that an industry-level compact may be necessary, but in agriculture, this may only be sustainable if real shifts in wealth and asset ownership are effected and land is owned more equitably by all South African communities and stakeholders. Until then, the battle against hunger and environmental degradation will be fraught with problems. This is where we'll have to leave it for today. Good night.